Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for those very nice words, and thanks, Ernst. And I'm very honored to be here, to be delivering this lecture. I didn't know when I was preparing it that the venue is a nightclub. But you'll decide whether the talk is funky enough for the occasion. I also want to say, just briefly, that I'm really happy to be at the inauguration of the UBS International Center of Economics and Society. I think this is a great time for having a dialogue among top scientists and the broader world, and it's a great time for the European academia to have such a center to retain the already existing top scholars and to attract more top scholars. So I think this is a great inauguration and celebration day for all of us. But let me turn to the topic of today. There is no doubt that Europe is in the middle of a deep crisis at the moment. What's more, it's in the midst of soul-searching about whether the whole European project, epitomized most clearly by the European Monetary Union, has been a failure. I'm not going to give yet another lecture about the current crisis. Instead, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the book that I have co-written with James Robinson, as Fabrizio mentioned, Why Nations Fail, and then draw some of the implications of the broader framework for the current crisis and its implications. I think there is an intellectual justification for this strategy. We can talk a lot about the crisis, but I think to understand what parts of the crisis are an inevitable conclusion of mistakes or choices that were made, and which ones are actually things that can be solved and redressed, requires a framework that identifies not only the choices and the political and historical process that brought us the choices, but also the very essence of what makes prosperity in terms of bringing economic development and economic growth tick at the national and supranational level. I hope that the framework that we'll offer has something to say on that. Let me start with a quintessentially famous question for economists and social scientists. What makes some societies prosperous and others not? This is, of course, as timely a question as any. Today, Europe is in the midst of a crisis, but if you look at the global world, we are still a globe of extreme inequality. At the time, Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations, another book that was greatly influenced by understanding the causes of prosperity and poverty around the world. The gap between the richest and the poorest nation in the world was of the order of 4- or 5-fold. Today, that number is over 40-fold. So Adam Smith has written one of the most influential and most important books founding the discipline of economics, but the puzzle has deepened since then. And of course, with such an important question, theories abound. And these theories actually have some bearing about the European situation also. If you turn to some journalists or to some academics, or even to the pages of respectable publications such as Science or Nature, you'll still see arguments that wealth of nations is made by geography. Some nations are condemned to poverty by their climate, by their soil type, by their disease environment, by their lack of resources or the types of resources they have, while others are favored by their geography. Even in the context of Europe, the distinction between the North and the South is oft repeated. I will argue that these sorts of geographic explanations have very little to contribute to our understanding. Even more popular than the geographic one would be a cultural view, espoused first perhaps by Max Weber's famous argument that Protestant ethic had a special place in the rise of capitalism. Scholars and thinkers and journalists have long drawn distinctions between Protestant versus Catholic ethics, Judeo-Christian values versus Buddhist or Islamic or other religious values, or much more importantly, between certain cultures that exist at the national level, between the Spanish culture versus the English one, or the German one versus the Greek one. And of course, these still play a very vitally important role in today's debate, with some of the arguments in the context of Europe pitting Germanic cultures against the Southern European cultures as part of the crucial ingredients of the current crisis. Yet another, perhaps even more popular among academics' view, is one that you can call enlightened leadership. This view would claim that prosperity is made by good leadership, leaders who make the right choices at the right time with courage bring prosperity, those who do not bring poverty. And of course, economists like this view very much, because we think that we are the advice givers to these good leaders, and of course you have good economists giving you advice, you generate poverty, you generate prosperity. That was a Freudian slip, wasn't planned at all. And if you have bad economists giving you advice, or no economists, God forbid, then that brings poverty. And of course, there is some truth to that. Of course, who better to analyze the intricacies of monetary policy than Lars Svensson and Jordi Gali and Philippe Pachetta? But the point is not that. The point is whether really enlightened leadership and the advice that good or bad advisors give is really at the root of prosperity and lack of growth and crises, as we have encountered. And I will again argue that this is quite a secondary factor when it comes to the crucial points that we want to understand. Instead, our book offers a different perspective. Our argument is that prosperity, poverty, growth, lack of growth, crises are often made by incentives and opportunities. And those incentives and opportunities are shaped by institutions. In particular, inclusive economic institutions, which protect private property, create the right environment for contract enforcement, create a judicial system that's unbiased and efficient, and, quite importantly, create a level playing field such that the citizens of a nation can all take part in economic activity starting from a relatively equal footing, generate economic growth, both in the long run and broadly also in the short run. However, not all nations today, and not all nations in history, are ruled by inclusive institutions. In fact, inclusive institutions are the exception. Extractive institutions are the norm throughout history. What we call extractive economic institutions, and the name here has some meaning, do the opposite. They don't create secure property rights. They don't encourage the right sort of contracts to be written. They certainly are not based on an unbiased judicial system, and they are very, very far from creating a level playing field. And there is a very good reason for that. These extractive institutions, as the name suggests, are designed not for enrichment of the nation as a whole, but to enrich a subset of it, which I'm going to call the elite, at the expense of society. They're created, designed, not by mistake, but for a purpose, to extract resources from that society for the benefit of the elite. Neither inclusive economic institutions nor extractive economic institutions exist in a vacuum. The best way of understanding that is to think of a quintessential example of extractive institutions, slavery. Of course, no better example of extractive institutions than slavery. No property rights. Majority of the population don't even have property rights to their own labor. No contracting, no free entry into occupations, no unbiased judicial system whatsoever. In fact, slavery is always based on coercion. How could it be otherwise? And slavery is always based what we call extractive political institutions that create political inequality, that concentrate political power in the hands of a small elite, just like the same elite that dominates economic institutions, and put very few constraints or checks on the exercise of that political power. Again, that's very sensible. Think of a society like Barbados in the 17th century. 90+ % of the population are slaves, living at subsistence, dying at subsistence, whose labor enriched a group of plantation owners to be the wealthiest people in the world. But of course, if there was political equality in Barbados, you would guess that maintaining the slavery system that impoverished them and worked them to death would not have been among the priorities of the slaves. The system had to rely on political inequality and did. If you look at who the judges are, they were the same small set of plantation owners. Who controlled military power? The same plantation owners. Who were the politicians? The same plantation owners. And that concentration of political power in the form of extractive political institutions was the basis of the extractive economic institutions in that society. Likewise, with inclusive economic institutions, they need to be situated with inclusive political institutions. But why am I claiming that these sets of ideas are so important for today? I'm going to illustrate that with an example. But before I do that, I think a couple of ideas are also important to bear in mind. The first one, which I'm going to talk about a little bit as I go along, is that institutions are inseparable from politics. This is for two reasons. The first one is, as I have highlighted, institutions are in the context of political institutions and interact with the political framework of a society. But second, and naturally, is that institutions are always conflictual. There are very few instances in which everybody in society is going to agree about what is the right set of institutions. Partly because there are different visions, but even more importantly than the different visions, because different institutions create different winners and losers. Again, think of slavery. Slavery made the plantation owners the wealthiest people in the world, while at the same time killing and impoverishing scores of people. There is a clear conflict between those who are crushed by those institutions and those who benefit from those institutions. When you look at modern society, that conflict may not be as violent and as apparent as the one in the slavery society, but it's always present. And that conflict in every society, be it a slaveholding society or be it a democracy, is resolved through the political process. And that's why politics and institutions are so strongly interwoven. The second thing, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, is that once you take this position about the importance of institutions, you really have to think about the process of institutional change. When is it that institutions change? How is it that they change? What can it be done to make that process of change more effective and more functional? So, large part of the book that James and I wrote is really about that, and I'm going to just take a great freedom in black boxing that today. But I want to give you more of a sense of why I am claiming these institutions are central, and also a little bit of this persistence and change aspect, more about how is it that different institutions come. And to do that, I'm going to take a little historical detour before coming back to Europe. I'm going to turn to a place which is most illustrative about both the types of inequities that we observe around the world and the process via which these inequities really emerge. The New World, the Americas. The institutions and the poverty of prosperity of the Americas are things that have been shaped under the influence of Europeans, so here is the European link, after Columbus's discovery of the New World. And those societies really did develop along very different trajectories. Today, we see some of the richest countries in the world, United States, Canada, and also some of the poorest, such as Haiti, in that world. Even if we leave out Haiti, places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia are among the very poor countries in the world, with a huge gap in per capita and prosperity between themselves and the United States. To understand how those gaps started, let's go back to the very beginning, to the process of colonization. So, of course, everybody here knows the story of Pizarro and Cortez, but let me start with a Spanish conquistador that is not as famous as them, Juan Díaz de Solís. And we'll see why he's not as famous. In 1516, he started, around the same time as Cortez started the colonization of the Aztecs, he started the colonization of what is today Uruguay and Argentina. Very fertile, very productive lands, which later would become the basis of a big agricultural boom. But de Solís had the same strategy of colonization that Cortez and Pizarro would perfect later. bring lots of armed men, capture Indians, put them to work, and hopefully get them to dig valuable metals, gold and silver. So he brought soldiers and goldsmiths with him. But there was a bad surprise waiting the Solis. Instead of big civilizations of the sort that Cortés and Pizarro encountered, he was encountered by Cheruas and the Quarendi, bands of hunter-gatherer, very sparsely settled, non-sedentary Indians that were very non-accommodating, very difficult to capture because they were so sparsely settled, very difficult to put to work even when captured, and very combative, and some of them actually clubbed de Solis to death shortly after his arrival. But more tragic than de Solis's death, the Spaniards started starving. They were surrounded by this hugely productive land, but none of them had any inclination or any skill in growing any food. They were expecting the Indians to do that for themselves, and the Indians were non-cooperating. So, just about ready to throw in the towel, another one of the conquistadors, Juan de Ayolas, sailed up the Parana River there and went to what is today Paraguay. There he encountered another band of Indians, the Guarani, who are also not Aztecs and the Incas, but they were already more developed, more densely settled, and hierarchical than the Quarendi and the Cheruas. And that was the sort of proposition that the Spanish conquistadors were after. So they immediately captured the Guarani. They took over their institutions. They declared themselves as the elite. They married some of the princesses. They put the Guarani to work so they're no more starving, so they could live in comfort. And they also started developing some of the famous extractive Spanish institutions, such as encomienda, land grant coming with labor attached to it, which was a very coercive labor institution. Things like repartimiento, different sort of coercive institutions that would later be perfected in Peru and Bolivia. And those institutions lasted in many parts of the Spanish America for many centuries. This was a very successful colonization strategy. The Spanish enriched themselves and their king. But of course, we can just talk about the Spanish perhaps colonizing a special place or bringing their own values or culture. So let's turn to North America for a second. So the North American colonization in earnest started about 90 years after this event. In 1607, in Virginia, the Jamestown colony. The Jamestown colony was colonized by the Virginia Company, a profit-maximizing enterprise based in London. It had shareholders. The shareholders were only interested in one thing, profit. And they sent 3 ships filled with armed men and goldsmiths, some parallel there, for one reason, to make profits. And in fact, they were very strongly inspired by the success of the Spanish. But just like the Solis, the Virginia Company's men had a surprise waiting. They were encountered, you guessed, by sparsely settled hunter-gatherer Indians that were extremely non-cooperative. And guess what happened? They started starving. In fact, it's called the starving time. It was only by a series of accidents that they sort of survived. But differently from the Spanish, they didn't have the option of moving up or down or to the left or to the right and finding another civilization. There were no Incas, no Guarani, no Aztecs in that part. So the Virginia Company started scratching its head. They said, well, we are really not successful in this endeavor, so we have to come up with a second strategy. Their second strategy turned out to be quite a bit similar to their first. They said, well, we cannot capture and put to work the Indians. Instead, we can bring our own lower strata from Europe, the indentured servants. The indentured servants really were a form of slaves. They would come, they would have to work under harsh conditions for the benefit of the elite, and they would enrich the elite in Jamestown colony and the shareholders back in Virginia. Just to give you an idea of what this indentured servant version of the Jamestown colony was, let me read from the laws that the governor, Sir Thomas Gates, and his deputy, Sir Thomas Dale, passed at this time. It says, "No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anybody who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his own private use upon pain of death. Well, two things should strike you out of this little snippet. First of all, this was no happy, shiny, consensual place. Pretty much anything you did was punishable by death. But second, there was some logic to this. They were afraid of something. Labor was their most valuable commodity, and they were afraid of losing labor. People had already started running away to the Indians, and many of them, instead of obeying this harsh, draconian work routine, they were trying to grow food on the side and sell it on the side. And those, of course, were undermining Virginia Company's ability to control, dominate, and extract resources from these indentured servants. But whatever the laws that they passed, the temptation of the open frontier to go it alone or to go to the Indians was too strong, so the Virginia Company decided that their second strategy was a failure too. So they came up with a third strategy. The third strategy was a very radical departure from what the Spanish had done and what the English themselves, the Virginia Company, had wanted to do. It was the first step in the Americas towards inclusive institution. They introduced what they called the headright system, in which every settler, or every male, as it turned out, would get a piece of land, and they would have private property to that land. That was the first in the colonies to have private property, actually. And they could grow whatever they wanted. They could sell it to whoever they wanted. So that was a huge innovation and a giant step towards inclusive economic institutions. But there was only one catch. There was Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale just a year ago threatening you with death because you sold an ear of corn to a sailor. And now they're telling you, you can have your private property, you can do whatever you want. Well, you'll be excused for not fully trusting them. And that's the problem. Inclusive economic institutions aren't really possible unless supported by some sort of political process. And that came 1 year later. In 1619, the Virginia Company threw in the towel entirely, and they said, okay, fine, we're going to let you govern the colony yourself. And they introduced the General Assembly, in which political power was now transferred to the settlers. I think this episode tells a very relevant story for understanding both the history of inclusive and extractive institutions, but also many ideas that are relevant even for our debates today. First of all, let's go back to the origins of prosperity and poverty in the North and South America. How did those come out? Well, as I'm going to talk about it a little bit in the, bringing also Europe into this picture, you will see that a lot of that took shape in the 19th century with the process of industrialization, and it was very much the inclusive institutions that emerged and evolved out of these experiments that took place in the Jamestown, but also similar events that took place in other colonies, the Carolinas, Baltimore, and other places, that also led to similar dynamics. But second, it also quite clearly highlights why, for understanding this sort of huge inequities and these big differences in prosperity and economic growth, we should really think about institutions, incentives, and opportunities, not about geography, not about culture, not so much about enlightened leadership. Let's think about this. Was it geography that meant that inclusive economic institutions and then growth would emerge in Virginia? No, not really. In fact, there wasn't anything geographically distinctive about that place. If you want to tell a story about the geography leading to prosperity, you have to tell it just the opposite. In fact, geographically, probably the places such as the Aztecs, the Mexico Valley, or where the Incas were more fertile because they were the ones that were supporting huge populations at the time the Europeans came. Virginia and many other parts of the United States were notable because of lack of dense populations. And there was nothing geographic that really made private property, private enterprise, and those sorts of institutions more likely to emerge there. As we saw, there were many fertile lands in other parts of the world. Was it culture? After all, the Spanish had Catholic culture, perhaps. They spoke a different language. They had a different king. They had different practices than the English. But actually, culture also had very little to do with it, as you can see from the episode also. Even though the English had very different culture, their strategy was identical. They were first influenced by the Spanish, but more importantly, it didn't really take a genius to work out what was the best way of extracting resources. That's why they had exactly the same sort of missions sent there, full of soldiers and goldsmiths, because they were after exactly the same thing. But the difference was the Spanish succeeded because they encountered different conditions on the ground, and the English failed. But it's also nothing to do with enlightened leadership. It wasn't that Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale were more enlightened and foresaw that private property would lead to a better system. Far from it. In fact, Pizarro Cortez succeeded. Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale failed. They failed in what they wanted to do, and they went home dejected. They had to give in to private property, not because they wanted to, because they had no other option. So, with this perspective, it should also be no surprise that South America, inheriting the sort of extractive economic and political institutions, did not prosper very strongly. If you look at South America and contrast it with North America, you see private property taking root only very weakly. You see that political power remained in the hands of Spain for a while, and then when independence was finally declared in many parts of the world, a new elite, most of the military, took power and started a huge process of infighting. When power stabilized, they used it to monopolize certain markets. When there were steps towards industry, this took the form of the politically connected firms getting special deals. When they had their own open frontier and expanded over towards the open frontier, instead of the United States, where this took place via Homestead Acts and so on, it took place with huge land grants being given to politically connected people. But how does this all inform us about Europe? What about European success and European failure? So that's to this topic that I want to turn to. And I want to start again with the history a little bit. The first distinctive thing about Europe is that Europe was the part of the world where both inclusive economic and political institutions first took root most strongly, and it was also the part of the world, not coincidentally of course, where economic growth and industrialization took place very rapidly. Of course, we see nascent inclusive institutions in other parts of the world and other eras, as going back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Venice Republic, which I'll talk about at the very end. But it was really in the 17th century, starting in England with the Glorious Revolution, where absolute monarchs were put in their place and political power was shifted to parliament, and there was an unprecedented amount of political equality created. And it was again with the Glorious Revolution and its aftermath that monopolies were fully removed from economic life. Contracting institutions started improving, and also bureaucracy and the state started becoming more efficient and more effective. And there is no surprise, it should be no surprise that Industrial Revolution started in England based on the foundations that the Glorious Revolution and the institutional developments that developed thereafter laid. So Industrial Revolution was based on a huge wave of new inventions and new tinkering that brought existing inventions to the factory floor. And it was also based on the ability of scores of people to actually take these ideas and put them into the production process. Importantly, this could not have taken place without some degree of inclusivity in economic institutions. But these economic institutions didn't, again, develop by themselves. Throughout the process, which was started by major political events going back to the English Civil War, before then to the 15th century, but also crucially with the Glorious Revolution, as I've mentioned, there was a process of political changes. It was those changes that finally culminated in the 19th century with mass franchise being introduced in Britain. But Britain was not an exception for Europe. There were many other parts of Europe that went through similar processes. In some cases, it was more conflictual than Britain, and it has to be emphasized that even in Britain, this wasn't a totally consensual affair. The Stuart monarchs, for example, in the English Civil War and thereafter in the Glorious Revolution, had to be defeated militarily for political power to shift away from them to the parliament. And after that process, new elites were created, for example, the Whig oligarchy, and political power had to be taken away from them, but more through electoral means throughout the 18th and the 19th centuries. But the important point is that this process went on in many parts of Europe. In France, for instance, it started again as a fight against absolutism, and with the French Revolution, which of course led to a period of intense stability and terror, but ultimately laid the foundations of inclusive institutions, inclusive political institutions, not only in France, but also much of Europe around the world, as those institutions got exported militarily or peacefully from France to Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, and elsewhere. And in all of these cases, you see political change coming together with economic change. Not only a process of democratization and greater political equality, but also a process of industrialization, more opening of markets and economic activity going more broadly distributed in society. And it wasn't just a process of entrepreneurship and innovation. Just like in the United States in the 19th century and thereafter, and in England, it was also built on a process of human capital accumulation by society. Some of this was informal through the apprenticeship systems, such as in England, but a lot of it was also formal schooling that was becoming more democratically provided all around Europe. But at this point, I want to go back to the two themes that I have talked about already. One is that this was not a consensual process. Every time a step forward was taken, it was with a fight. Some of that fighting was at the ballot, some of that fighting was on the streets, but it was always a fight. The elites never gave in when it was against their interests. Second, there wasn't any sort of special European values that really encouraged this process. And you can see that through several examples. First, at the same time as the Europeans were building inclusive institutions at home, they were also propagating, building extractive institutions around the world. It wasn't just the British or the English in the 17th century trying to form extractive institutions in the Americas. It was the French, it was the Belgians, it was the English who were trying to build viciously extractive empires around the world. And second, whenever the elite in Europe felt empowered, they resisted the new inclusive institutions, and they resisted even economic prosperity and industrialization. Sometimes through malignant neglect, not benign neglect. Malignant neglect, meaning as in Spain, where the elite domination had destroyed society so much that there wasn't even much industrialization going on. But when there were moves towards industrialization, the elite does not hesitate to expressly block that. For example, as in Austria-Hungary or Russia, where in both cases the powerful monarchs, such as Francis I in Austria-Hungary or Nikolai I in Russia, steadfastly refused both factories and new industrial technology and railways for the very same reason. They thought it would be politically destabilizing. First, it would bring a new group of powerful men, and they didn't want anybody to compete with them. And second, it would lead to the congregation of workers, God forbid, who might try to get ideas into their head and demand rights. And those meant that Austria-Hungary and Russia, well into the second half of the 19th century, would block even the most basic technologies and the most basic transport improvements. So, 19th century was overall a century of growth for Europe because in many parts of Europe, the elites weren't as powerful as Nikolai I and Francis I. So part of European success was built indeed on the same process that the North American story that I told you gave us some clues about. It was built on political institutions becoming more inclusive, in the process, economic institutions becoming more inclusive, and as a result of these incentives and opportunities, encouraging new economic activities, industrialization, innovation, and entrepreneurship. What about more recent European growth? Well, more recent European growth, we have to start in 1945. In 1945, many people would have guessed that Europe was in no state for being one of the most powerful economies in the world. Europe was dejected. It was destroyed. It was demoralized. In Germany, about 10% of the population was killed. 20 million people were homeless. Many of the major cities, Düsseldorf, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, Hamburg, were flattened by bombing. The Red Army had occupied half of the country, and millions of Germans were going to come yet from Eastern Europe dislocated. In England, which had passed the war most lightly in Europe, still there was a lot of damage, and technologically, just like the rest of Europe, everything was backward. At the end of the world, more than half of the households in England, in Britain, had no access to hot water or indoor plumbing. The situation in continental Europe was worse. The economic infrastructure was in tatters, but even more importantly, probably most people thought at the time that there was no future for Europe, because what was there to prevent the repetition of the events that had led to the First World War and then to the Second World War thereafter. In the event, something entirely different happened. The 3 decades that followed the end of World War II were the fastest growing period in European history ever. Even after the oil price shock, Europe continued to grow relatively rapidly. So, what explains that success? Well, I will claim that that success was also due to institutions. Again, broadly inclusive economic institutions and very strongly inclusive political institutions in much of Europe. But crucially, just in the same sense that it doesn't make so much sense to talk of inclusive institutions in Massachusetts, it is very difficult to talk of inclusive institutions in a European country, be it Switzerland, be it France, be it Germany, without really thinking of the set of institutions, international institutions, that the national ones are situated in. So the crucial step for Europe was that European institutions became much more inclusive. And they became much more stable. Europe, contrary to the expectations of most who wrote very prominently after the end of the world, has been a very, very peaceful society, has been a very democratic society. No international wars, no successful coups, and really within the borders of Europe, if you leave Yugoslavia out, not even a civil war. How did Europe achieve this? As I mentioned, I think inclusivity of political institutions is crucial. But we have to explain how is it that these political institutions managed to be inclusive? How is it that they actually consolidated that? I think you can point out several important factors. For instance, the historian Tony Judd argues that one important factor was, paradoxically, the genocidal policies of Hitler and Stalin that removed many of the ethnic tapestry that existed in Europe, confining the Germans to their borders, and that created stability. Perhaps, we will never know. Some other people mention the international rivalry between Soviet Union and the United States. Perhaps the threat of Soviet Union and the NATO presence there was crucial in the emergence of political stability in Europe. Probably. But I think the most important institution is the European Union. It was the project of the European Union that brought political stability. peace and trade between France and Germany and England and Britain. It was the European Union's project of bringing greater economic integration for exactly the same reasons that I have been sort of hinting at, that you need inclusive political institutions for inclusive economic institutions, but the feedback goes the other way around too. Inclusive economic institutions will also make it more likely that inclusive political institutions survive. And that was the logic that we see in action in the functioning of the European Union. Trade was important not only for the enrichment of the European economies, but it was a way of solidifying the political pact. And it was thanks to these set of institutional arrangements that national democracies became stronger, national institutions became economically more open, and underpinned an environment in which technology improved rapidly in Europe, first by being imported from the US, but then Europe itself pushing the frontiers of technological knowledge in the world. But of course, today, what is in our minds is not so much European success, but European failure. We are now in the midst of the crisis. How did that crisis come about? And again, I am not an expert in thinking about the intricacies of the European monetary system. There are much more informed people here in this audience. But what I want to do is, I want to point out, first, the institutional roots of the crisis, with some of them economically and some of them politically being shaped by the decades prior to the 2008, 2009, but also perhaps use this as a way of understanding what the way forward might be, so that the European success, European failure is followed by yet another European success, not yet one more European failure. I think there are a couple of important points to note here. The first one is that there are some structural reasons that at the same time account for European success, but also have played some role in the European failure to take root. And I think understanding these is important because they are not just weaknesses, but they are also points of strength for Europe, but it's important to analyze them. The first one is in the nature of the European institutions as they formed after World War II. The big problem that Europe was facing was one of creating peace. It wasn't just peace between France and Germany, but also peace within nations. If you look at how things unraveled in Europe in the interwar era, they unraveled from two sources. First, they unraveled in places such as Weimar Republic because the domestic conflicts were too strong, too pronounced, and not correctly mediated. And second, they unraveled internationally because the international dimension, international rivalry added to these conflicts, and ultimately were, of course, fanned by the domestic problems when the Nazis exported all of the violence from their home territory to the rest of Europe. But why was it that the Weimar Republic was such a failure? Well, part of the reason why the Weimar Republic was such a failure is because it was situated in the midst of a very deep conflict between groups coming down from the Bismarckian time of the German society that were bent against any sort of liberalizing, any sort of forming of political equality, inclusiveness in society, versus groups that, be it the Social Democrats or the Communists, that had objectives that were totally unacceptable to the nationalist traditional elites in Germany. And those sorts of conflicts really became the undoing of the Weimar Republic way before Hitler rose to power, in the sense that the nationalist elite, both in academia, in the military, in the police, in the bureaucracy, started working for the destruction of the Weimar institutions itself. So the lesson that I think European policymakers should have drawn, and probably did draw, is that if Europe was going to survive, it needed what we would call inclusive political institutions, and they had to be guaranteed both by peace at home and peace abroad. And what that meant is European Union for the pact, especially between France and Germany, but also at home a more cooperative social pact such that these distributional conflicts could be managed, could be mediated, growth would be more equally distributed, and the state was always there to sort of play that mediation role on the ground. And that worked extremely well for three reasons. First, if the analysis was that you needed that sort of cooperative social compact to make the peace stick, it did work. Democracies flourished, distributional conflicts within these societies, always present, never became a threat to the stability of the system. But secondly, it worked from an economic point of view. Europe, at the time, was behind the world technology frontier. So being behind the world technology frontier, what it required was a stable environment which would also invest in the workers and create a market for firms when they invested and brought the technology over. And for that, a peaceful, stable environment, even if it wasn't perhaps the one that encouraged innovation in the most risk-taking fashion, was quite good. So Europe was able to grow very successfully with institutions that were quite well calibrated to bring social peace and at the same time to import technology. But of course, there's only so much that you can grow by importing technology. That started running its course in the 1980s and the 1990s. At that point, Europe had to translate its institutions, and it had the flexibility to do so based on democratic foundations, towards more innovation-friendly ones. And I think that process is a difficult one because it will create exactly the same sort of winners and losers that, for instance, the industrialization process created. And that's the reason why places such as Austria-Hungary and Russia resisted that industrialization process. And that transition has taken place only imperfectly in Europe. Perhaps it has taken place in Germany, perhaps it has taken in some of the peripheral countries such as Finland, but it is mostly work in progress. And as those structural problems accumulate, Europe's growth performance started becoming more strained. I think that is one of the important things that needs to be borne in mind because it's an additional factor contributing to the European problems over and above the macroeconomic ones, and ignoring it, I think, would be an invitation to just think of short-term fixes without thinking of the long-term problems. The second is political in nature. The European Union, as I've tried to argue, was a political project. Political project very much integrated into the economic institutions, but mostly driven by a political imperative. And that imperative, to survive and to flourish, needed to move forward towards integration. It was, I think, again, I think there could be some debate on this, but it was part of the vision of the early founders of the European Union, going to Monnet, Schuman, Delors, and others, that you couldn't just stop with a single market. You had to go to a greater amount of political integration. And the European Monetary Union was part of that greater integration. In the minds of some policymakers, this was a necessary step because it was just the next step. I think that was part of the problem. In the minds of some other policymakers, it was a necessary step because it would be a step towards greater fiscal and political integration. Although how exactly monetary union would later itself bring greater fiscal and monetary integration wasn't always well articulated. And I think the problem that was overlooked in creating the European Monetary Union was that these structural problems that I have highlighted were uneven across countries. Some countries were much better at already starting to reform their institutions towards more innovation and technology and entrepreneurship-friendly ones, while others were lagging behind. So perhaps institutional heterogeneity in Europe was increasing rather than diminishing at the time that the European Monetary Union started its functioning in 1991 and 1992. But even more ominously, parts of Europe, especially in Southern Europe, were still reeling from their dictatorial past, and their political systems did not have the inclusive strength that one would expect in becoming part of a greater national or supranational body. So the institutional the heterogeneity at the time of the European Union was extremely strong. More ominously perhaps than that was the way in which the European Union was brought online. I will come back to this a little bit more in the last few minutes in discussing about the way forward. But the way that the European Monetary Union was brought was that it was essentially an implicit guarantee to the markets that all of these heterogeneous governments and their debts were equally secure. The success of the system was partly judged by bringing down the risk premia. But bringing down the risk premia wasn't just success, but it was part of the problem. Because once the risk premia was brought down, that was invitation for capital flows to change direction within Europe. So in particular, current accounts deficits, of course, ballooned in many parts of Europe, but that was part of a deeper problem that those capital flows were relaxing political constraints in many parts of the world. So in Greece, for example, the corrupt political system that was already problematic before 1991, based very much on two parties that were based on patronage and clientelism, now had a big pile of money that they could throw around, they could put in their pockets. Corruption became much more rampant, and they could start using it for buying support at the polls with big tax breaks for different groups and salary increases for civil servants and so on. In some sense, instead of solving political problems, which of course the European Union is extremely capable of when it did in the context of the Eastern European transition, where the prospect of joining the European Union was a factor in many of the Eastern European countries improving their economic and political institutions strongly. Actually, the European Union, in the context of the European monetary system, started becoming a force towards deterioration of political institutions. And when the crisis struck, then this time the political system of the European Union proved to be highly ineffective. Not only it wasn't centralized or unified enough to take decisive action, but it also showed that it was very much beholden to special interests in the decisions that it made. So the interests of financial institutions that were nationally powerful became much more important than the survival of the European Union or the euro in deciding how to deal with the financial crisis. So restructuring was delayed, no action was taken, and so on. So, in summary, I think one way of thinking about the European crisis, and therefore this big part of the European failure in the minds of many of us, is that it was the perfect storm of structural problems with macroeconomic difficulties that heightened those structural problems. And then put in a dose of bad policy, and the whole thing became a poisonous mix. What about the future? What does this say about the sequence of European success, European failure? Is it going to be followed by another European failure or by another European success? I think that's very much up for grabs. What I will argue is that Europe has just the right ingredients to turn failure into success. And I will try to highlight what I think those ingredients are, And I will also highlight some of the important steps that I think need to be taken in that process, though, of course, I realize that some of these would be controversial, and definitely in all of this, I am stepping way beyond my expertise in thinking about the role of inclusive and extractive institutions in understanding big differences in economic prosperity around the world. So let me first say why I think Europe has the right ingredients to turn this failure into success. It again goes back to the compact that started forming in Europe after World War II and the way that economic and political institutions in Europe have evolved. Europe nationally has very strong, at least the core of Europe, nationally has very strong political institutions. And these institutions, differently from the United States, for example, which I'll mention briefly in a second in this context, haven't been as much challenged by the economic and global developments of the last 30 years. And here, one of the great assets of Europe is again that social compact that created a relatively equal distribution of income, relatively active civil society with political participation through a variety of bodies from unions to business associations, and also as a result of these, a very strong educational system that creates a broad level playing field so that much of the population, if not, of course not all, are actually well prepared in terms of skills to deal with a changing environment. In fact, that strength is not to be understated. If you look at the United States today, the United States did not have some of the same problems, some of the same structural problems that Europe has. The United States did not have to build a social compact with the state in the middle of it. And as a result, throughout this post-war era, as well as before, the United States was a technologically very innovative country with very risk-taking entrepreneurs and very dynamic private sector. But the last 30 years have been quite challenging for the United States also. The last 30 years have created yet another perfect storm, now for the United States, which consisted of globalization and technological changes that have been favoring skilled workers and routinizing and replacing tasks previously performed by unskilled and middle-skilled workers. As a result, the United States has experienced a very strong tidal wave towards greater inequality. US median income households haven't seen their incomes increase by much since the 1970s. And the top income inequality in the United States, for example, the share that the top 1% or the top 0.1% capture, has reached sky-high levels. For instance, the top 1%, which commanded about 10% of national product in the United States, today is close to 25%. Those are huge numbers. Together with that economic inequality, there has been greater political polarization in the United States. The political system is as polarized or more polarized than it has ever been. And there are also serious concerns about the role of money and influence in politics that come outside electoral channels, which are a real challenge to the health of these institutions. All of these problems are easier to handle in Europe because, ironically, the same social compact that created the structural problems, because that social compact also limited the extent of the increase in inequality. It limited the direct impact of globalization and the skill-biased technological change on the wage structure, and it also limited to some extent, but not fully, the role of money and special influence in politics. So in that respect, I think Europe is well placed institutionally to remain inclusive, and as it remains inclusive, to deal with serious political challenges. But the political challenges are serious. In particular, the European Monetary Union, without any sort of banking union, fiscal centralization, or political integration, is a very precarious situation. We've been here before with the United States at the Articles of Confederation. United States with the 13 colonies tried this system, and the free rider problems that it created and the macroeconomic instabilities that it created was too much. The United States then managed to overcome that, in turn leveraging its own strongly inclusive institutions for their time in building up to the US Constitution, which did several things. First, it centralized fiscal power to the federal level in the form of fiscal federalism. So not getting rid of the states, but in the form of fiscal federalism. It's centralized politically. Political power shifted up to the central level. And very, very important political power. For example, with the US Constitution, the decision to declare war was now of the federal government. The states had no more say on whether the United States would declare war or not. And it also laid the foundations of the US Civil War, not a trivial event at all. But also, it enabled the US federal government to engage in a massive amount of redistribution across states, something that would not have been possible without the umbrella of a centralized political power. The United States federal government pardoned the debts, nationalized the debts of the indebted states and indebted sectors, and created a huge amount of redistribution backed by the power of the state. I think there is no other way but for Europe to go down that path also. But I think it is an illusion to think that that path can be pursued without conflict. In the same way as there was conflict in the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution, there will be conflict. Redistribution is part and parcel of this. The problem is inclusive institutions are good at mediating conflict. They are good at telling the losers, well, you are the losers, you cannot do anything, or compensating them to some degree so that the loss is not so strong. So redistribution away from the core towards the periphery is unavoidable. But of course, it cannot happen in the context of European Union at the moment. It needs to have political and fiscal centralization as part of it. But therein is another big catch. Can you imagine the same sort of political and fiscal centralization taking place at the US Constitution, but with a totally unelected, unaccountable, unrepresentative federal government? I think it's unthinkable. Americans had fought the War of Independence for no taxation without representation. They were not going to delegate political power, huge amount of political power to the center without having some democratic checks, accountability, representation. And that's exactly what they did. From the get-go, the federal government was responsible, was elected, was subject to checks and balances. And look at Europe. It's the opposite. Again, the haste of the political project that the European Union had created a body that's on the one hand entirely undemocratic in Brussels, not accountable to anybody. On the other hand, only imperfectly empowered. It's not clear what it has, what powers it has. So the process has to go as one of the supranational institutions of Europe becoming more powerful as they also become more accountable and more representative. I think there is no way around it. That's the only possibility, that those two processes have to go hand in hand. You cannot first say, we're going to make them democratic when they have no power. And you cannot say that you're going to make them extremely powerful while still remaining unaccountable and unrepresentative. And I think at some level, the institutional equilibrium in Europe and the crisis create an opportunity for it. Because there is, I think, a path towards that. First, the banking union, I think, is a great opportunity. Why? I don't think the banking union is a solution to all the problems. But the banking union, I think, if done correctly, and at the moment the signs are that it may not be, exemplifies exactly how such a process can be managed in an inclusive society. Give and take. The principle is inclusive societies deal with losers by give and take. So banking union will have to involve deposit insurance, which is a huge transfers to the indebted nations, to Spain, to Greece, to Portugal. But at the same time, it has to come together with banking supervision, so that from now on there are very clear rules about what Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, Irish banks can do, what assets they can hold, and so that they are no longer under the control of their own politicians. That, I think, is a is a template for how the process of greater fiscal, economic, and political centralization has to go. At each step, there has to be a compact that builds on the existing inclusiveness of institutions and creates both some transfers towards a group, but also, as the resources are being transferred, authority to control further resources and the use of resources is being transferred to a higher level, so that healthy sort of fiscal federalism is built. That's exactly how the US Constitution did it. As it was forgiving the debts of the states, it also took some part of the fiscal power away from them. So the next step, if a banking union can be successfully done, would be a fiscal centralization, where foundations of fiscal federalism start being built in Europe. And ultimately, I think this has to lead to a greater political centralization also, which of course is a sine qua non for democracy to exist at the European level. But also, one has to be realistic. This process isn't easy, and there are many barriers against it. First, probably the institutional heterogeneity, economic heterogeneity, is higher today among European countries than among the 13 colonies. Second, and perhaps more ominously, we only have the current political leadership to take us there. And the current political leadership in Europe hasn't failed and hasn't missed an opportunity to miss the opportunity, to actually do some reforms that will take Europe towards a safer footing. And I think there is a real twisted logic to what we are asking the current leadership to do. Ultimately, we are asking them to destroy their own rents, their own power base, their own political power, and start a process in which they will hand power to a different set of politicians. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing. But ultimately, I don't think it's impossible. There has been no society in history that has comprehensively reformed its institutions because its elites wanted to do so. Almost all cases, elites have been either threatened, they were threatened by outsiders and they had to build their own state in order to ensure their survival. They have been threatened by people who did not have political power, who walked onto the streets, as during the British democratization, during the French Revolution, and in the 19th century in France. Or they have been threatened by other events that forcefully took the power away from them. So I think if there is actually hope, is that there has to be a bottom-up process with the European citizens, recognizing that although all politics is local, some of the objectives are far from local. They are at the European level. And it's people like those in the room setting the information and the vision for this broader political process to take place. Because, again, if we just leave it to the national politicians in France or in Germany or elsewhere, they're not going to be the ones to have the greatest zeal for doing so or the capability of doing so. But overall, I think the inclusive past of European institutions that have taken their own strong and healthy path is the best guarantor we have that the next one will be European success, not failure. Thank you.
So we have some limited time for questions that I would ask you to keep brief. Unfortunately, I don't see much on the back of the, so they'll probably take most questions from the front.
Daron, thank you very much for your presentation. Okay. Let me challenge your basic premise. I would say geography matters enormously in shaping the institutions of countries and nations. Let me bring as a short example the history of Germany. There has been a fantastic book by the Harvard historian Stephen Osmond about the question why in the history of Germany didn't institutions of liberty and freedom comparable to the English-speaking world not evolve? His explanation was Germany was for hundreds of years like a highway for superpowers which went with their armies through the German territories, which created among the Germans different Fürstentümer, a high inclination and desire to build a strong state with strong military and institutions which were completely different from institutions we built in Switzerland, where we have been protected by the natural environment of our Alps and were therefore not forced to build a strong state as the Germans had to do. So why can you say that geography is not a crucial factor in building and shaping institutions?
Okay, let me clarify. I think it's an excellent question. So I think one has to distinguish between two very different viewpoints. One is that geography has a direct effect on prosperity. There is something special about being on the Mediterranean or being on Central America or being in the Caribbean that condemns a nation to poverty. Versus another view, which is very much consistent with what I have argued and what James and I argue in our book, which is that institutions are important and institutions are shaped by a variety of factors. Geographic ones are some of them, and in fact they've played a central role. So I've in fact told you a story about the Americas. Why was it that Mexico ended up with extractive institutions and not Massachusetts? Part of the story, a large part of the story, as I've explained, is that Mexico at the time the Europeans came already had a dense population. It could not have had a dense population if it did not have a very fertile area. It did not have a valley along which a big state could be formed. So those geographic factors in that specific juncture influenced development. And in the case of Switzerland, that's a very old argument that goes back, for example, to William McNeill, that the specific location of Switzerland was very important in its political development also. So I think none of these are in question. But it's also very important that there is no necessity that there is an effect from Germany's position today to Germany's institutions today. In the same way that the dense population in Mexico City mattered for institutional development at a specific historical juncture when the Europeans conquered the Americas. German geography may or may not have, on the Swiss one I know, but on the German one I don't know, may or may not have played an important in the development of the German institutions. But what's relevant for today is the history of German institutions, not that geography anymore. Today, Germany is not a highway along which the barbarians and others are fighting. So in that sense, if there are any specific things to the south of Europe, and of course we use the south of Europe because there are some commonalities, it is their institutions. It's not their Mediterranean climate or the fact that they have many Club Meds along their shores.
So we need... hello? Can you hear me? So we need to be inclusive. That means short questions.
And short answers.
And also short answers. But so I will collect now 3 questions, 1, 2, and 3. And Daniel.
Okay. To apply your theory, sir, what is your judgment about our institution of direct democracy in terms of its economic contributions and benefits? Thank you.
Excellent. Here.
Hi. My question is, institutions, I mean, you argued very convincingly that institutions are very relevant, and you kind of ruled out culture as a possible explanation. But I wonder to what extent there is some sort of an interaction between culture and institutions. I mean, we have seen many cases in which institutions have been changed, and yet nothing has changed in terms of behavior. So I understand that institutions are all about incentives, but...
This is a very Italian perspective, I have a feeling. So, another question. Okay. 2 then. Fine.
I know that your lecture is mainly about Europe, but I wanted to know where you see the inclusive institutions in China.
Okay. Last one before round. No, there is...
If I may ask a quick question.
Yes, please.
So you know, as you know, from the literature on size and number of nations, there is a trade-off. And if you see, many of the big multi-ethnic states collapsed. The Osmanian Empire, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, all the civil wars with secessionist civil wars in Africa. So is it really a good idea to create a new mega state that is very heterogeneous, if even like Belgium is not kind of sticking together very well?
Thank you, Dominic. There is one person who is asking for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. There is only one point missing. You haven't talked about economic growth. How can you further develop inclusive institutions without economic growth and with much higher unemployment to come? That's my question.
Daron,
Okay, so do I have 2 hours?
you mean 2 minutes?
So, direct democracy. I mean, I think direct democracy is not a panacea. I think, I'm no expert on Swiss institutions, but we see direct democracy work in Switzerland and become a total disaster in California. I think what's much more important in Switzerland is that it's a democratic tradition with fiscal federalism in a way that works, but it's also not a model that other countries can easily emulate, because I think Switzerland exists in this healthy form partly because it benefits from Europe around it. So I think some of the features of Switzerland, I think fiscal federalism and a broad state that supports a relatively level playing field without becoming too intrusive, I think those are great things to aspire for, but I think the ease with which Switzerland has been able to consolidate these institutions could be deceptive for the rest of Europe. About culture. So absolutely. I mean, I think culture is an overall catchphrase. When I'm talking of culture, I really want to dismiss the explanations that are based on unchanging cultural characteristics that are certain national culture, certain religious characteristics, certain racial characteristics. There's no doubt that norms, beliefs, and so on are important for the functioning of institutions. And a lot of what we talk about in the book is what we call about de facto power. Power that's not really codified in constitutions, but exists because groups are able to organize, solve collective action problems, they're able to mobilize, and I think that touches your point. But there is still another issue, which is, when institutions change, what happens to beliefs, norms, and so on? And I think that's a very interesting research area. We're very much in the infancy of that. We have many examples in which beliefs and social norms change very sharply when institutions change. Look at China. Today it's a very strong individualistic culture that absolutely did not exist 30 years ago. Look at the US South, where everybody predicted that slavery and the Jim Crow sort of legacy would never be erased. But then you see places like south of Italy, where within the same national institutions has emerged very differently. But I think there you really have to also think: are the institutions in the south the same as in the north? I think that's also as much a case of distorted reform as effective reform. On China. Yes, we spend a lot of time in the book on China. I think our take on China is that you really need to tell a two-part story. The first one is that China is very rich today, exactly for the reason. Is growing very rapidly today, exactly for the reasons that. Exactly for the sorts of reasons that we emphasize, which is that from some of the most distortionary institutions, it has taken steps towards much more inclusive economic institutions. Very far from the sort of inclusive economic institutions that we should aspire to, but still huge steps. First in agriculture, where price incentives were introduced in a fairly fundamental fashion, starting in the late 1970s and quite comprehensively during the 1980s, and then in the urban sector. But it still remains much of a work in progress in terms of economic institutions, but more importantly, it is very much a growth under the auspices of extractive political institutions, an authoritarian state that's extremely repressive and very much concentrates political power in the hands of a very small cabal. So how is that possible? Well, I think that the way why that is possible, and again, it's something we discuss a lot in the book, but I didn't have time to get into, is that one has to really distinguish between catch-up growth and sustained growth. As I have already mentioned, hinted at in the context of European Union, when growth has to build on importing technology or investing in areas that has already been understood, you can do so with institutions that are not as the same ones as those that are going to create innovation, and they can also do it under the auspices of relatively or quite sharply authoritarian institutions. We have seen that in the Soviet Union. We have seen that in the slavery societies that have grown very rapidly. So in that sense, China is in the midst of what we call growth under extractive institutions that can progress rapidly, but it will come to an end, according to our framework, unless political and economic reform continue. And of course, there are real barriers to that happening in China, which many people are today thinking about, given the handoff of power, which is of course taking place extremely non-democratically in China at the moment. I think I should stop there.
Let me take two very brief questions, because I understand that there were a couple of people who were ignored. Please, that's one, and please.
Thank you. Daron, many thanks for this insightful lecture. You're referring quite a few times during it to elites and how they build up and then how they at some point fail. So for the future of Europe, you were also talking about it. And who could possibly threaten the current elite in Europe?
Who are the current elites in Europe, or who could threaten?
Who could possibly threaten them?
I think it's not a question of threat, because yes, you're absolutely right that when you think of a society such as, you know, the Middle East, for example, in the just leading up to the Arab Spring, what you need is threats. You know, Mubarak would not have left out of his own will. In fact, he tried to stay on, and it was the real threat of being thrown out of power violently that made him that convinced him finally to step aside. And that's exactly what happened in the 19th century Britain, when the elites begrudgingly gave in to democracy. You know, Europe is a democratic society. So the voters have the power to throw away current incumbents and replace them. The voters have the right to pass laws that will support economic reform. I think the problem is that the political system in Europe has survived too long while avoiding fundamental structural reforms, both economic and more broadly. And I think what you require is not so much the same sort of threat that we need in the 19th century England, but you need the bottom-up participation and people having their voices heard. And of course, right now, you know, we are in an equilibrium in which people only have their voices heard when their special interests are threatened. You hear from the French unions whenever, you know, there is any discussion of increasing the social, retirement age, but you don't hear from, you know, the consumers or the people who would have benefited from new businesses opening or from liberalization in the product markets, because they are not very well organized, and there are other issues along which the political parties divide their allegiances. So I think it's not as easy a process as people in Egypt going to Tahrir Square and saying Mubarak should go because he is the symbol of an extractive system. But on the other hand, fortunately, it's not a very violent process also, that voters can actually have their voices heard through newspapers, through civil society organizations, through this political system.
So let me thank warmly Daron for this great lecture and set of answers and discussion. So thank you very much, Daron.
Thank you, Fabrizio.